It is my pleasure to welcome back to the Soapbox Christopher Beam. He is a professor of history at the University of Southern Maine. He spent 4.5 years working at the National Archives, archiving the Nixon tapes, among other things, and also worked in the Muskie Archives at Bates College. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, Eric.
So welcome back to the show, Chris.
Well, thanks, Eric. Glad to be here.
So last time you were here, it was on the anniversary of the Nixon tapes, and we were talking about that and about Vietnam, among some other things. But I thought tonight we could talk a bit about the Civil War and its relevance on contemporary society and really what we have to learn from it. I think it's one of those historical topics, like so many others in America, that is pretty widely misunderstood. So perhaps we could start at the sort of central question of, what was this a war about? Was it a war about slavery, like is the common sort of reductionistic explanation, or was it about a broader battle of ideologies? How would you summarize what this was actually about?
Well, I think it was both the points you mentioned and much more. Slavery, I think, was at the heart of what caused the division between North and South. By 1860, all of the states north of the Mason-Dixon line and the Ohio River had abolished slavery, had prohibited it. Whereas it was permitted and actually had become deeply entrenched in those states south of that line that I mentioned. And there was a growing chasm over the question of slavery. Now, I think there are quite a number of concerted attempts to compromise, but things really became unstuck starting in the 1850s and culminating in the election of 1860 with Lincoln as president and Republicans taking over the House of Representatives.
And now that was a pretty monumental thing at the time, wasn't it, Chris? Because the Republican Party they were brand new within, the year or two before that election?
No, they had been formed, the Republican Party had been formed in 1854, so it had only been in existence for 6 years and had a meteoric rise. It was formed when the second political party system of Whigs and Democrats broke up. The Democratic Party remained with a strong base in the South, but the Whig Party had disintegrated, mostly over the issue of slavery. And there were some other related issues, like immigration, actually.
So what was the ideological constitution of the Whig Party as it compares to, say, the Democrats of the time and the Republicans of the time?
This is one of the interesting paradoxes of American political history, and that is that the Whigs were generally in favor of a more active federal government in terms of promoting economic development. They wanted a system of internal improvements where the federal government would impose relatively high tariffs, would foster the development of a cohesive railroad network, telegraph network, and also would foster the settlement of the West through homestead legislation. The Democrats, so they basically believed in a far more active federal government. The Democrats at that time believed that this would be dangerous, or at least would favor certain interests that they opposed, and certainly one of the bases of the Democratic Party was the slave South, and certainly by the 1850s there was a growing body of elite opinion in the South, or at least among white Southerners, that they were losing out, that slavery, which was the basis of their way of life, was in increasing danger, both because anti-slavery feeling was growing in the North. The Republican Party, which had formed, was adamant in preventing the expansion of slavery into new territories. And this became a big issue in the wake of the Mexican War, because with the Mexican War, what is now the Southwest, a huge chunk of territory was acquired by the United States. So
help me sort of understand where the Republican Party of the time was, because I think it can be easy for people to sort of confuse where the party stood relative to where they stand currently. So what was behind the then new Republican Party's opposition to slavery? Was it?
Well, let's be careful of this,
Okay.
and this is where I guess the history teacher in me comes out, where we have to be a little bit nuanced, a little bit picky, a little bit precise in our definitions. The Republican Party, up until including the election of 1860, was a free soil party. Not an abolitionist or anti-slavery party. In other words, what it did was, the basic tenet was it would oppose any expansion of slavery into any new territory beyond where it was already existed.
Oh, okay, so why was that? So I understand your distinction.
Well,
they weren't quite anti-slavery, but they were opposed to the expansion of slavery.
Expansion of slavery.
But why was that?
Well, there were a lot of people, especially in the North, who did not want slavery to move into new territories, primarily in the West. The West was, and when I'm talking about the West, I'm talking about the Trans-Mississippi West, was seen as really the future of the country, and it assumed almost mythic proportions. Mm-hmm. And there was an increasing tide of settlement into the West. And there was a large body of opinion, quite widespread, that they did not want slavery in there because slave ownership meant unfair competition, both from slaves and from those who owned slaves. And also, paradoxically, there was a strong element of racism in this. In other words, if slavery is kept out of a territory, so will blacks. And there were many northern states that tried to restrict blacks from moving into the states. For example, Ohio said that any black person moving into the state had to post bond. Now, a lot of that legislation was gotten rid of during the Civil War.
So when you, just stepping back for a moment, when you say there was the perception of the potential for unfair competition, what do you mean by that exactly? That people who couldn't afford slaves would be expected to compete with people who could afford slaves?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And slavery, interestingly enough, and again, this is one of the myths I sometimes hear, slavery is actually a very expensive form of labor. I like to say slaves aren't free, which sounds pretty obvious. But slavery as a form of labor required the expenditure of capital up front. For example, by 1860, a field hand might cost $600 to purchase. That's money that has to be put up front before they do any work. Whereas a day laborer, a free day laborer making $300 a year, they don't get paid until they do something, and only for the work that they do.
Right,
so
and
free labor was actually a cheaper form of labor, and this became a part of the escalating war between the sections and over slavery.
Yeah, I mean, Professor Noam Chomsky has made this point recently where he talks about just that, how slavery was more expensive than people recognize, and how it was replaced with what is ultimately was a great boon to some of the more moneyed corporate interests of society, because they could have cheaper wage laborers. And we also have, and now I might be veering into some controversial territory, but we've got this prison industrial complex with forced labor happening in the prisons for, currently for about $1 a day at times. And that labor is sold by private for-profit prisons to private for-profit corporations for a lot of money. So is it that we replaced a broken system with another broken system?
Well, I guess I wouldn't look at it this way. I don't know what Noam Chomsky has said about American history or that aspect of American history. No free labor in the North ever supported enslavement, certainly if it touched them. I mean, now they may have supported, if they were whites, and they supported black enslavement, but nobody wanted to become a slave. And so Southern propagandists or pro-slavery propagandists who argued that laborers in the North were wage slaves, I think is a bit disingenuous. No doubt laborers in the North particularly in the industrial sector, faced harsh conditions and so forth. But they were free. They could quit their jobs, and many of them did. There was a high turnover rate in the job sector.
And what kind of labor movement was there at the time? Were
Well,
they free to organize? And
not much.
Okay.
No, I mean, there were, in the 1830s and 40s, there were incipient, what we would call proto-labor unions. But the ideal at the time, and I think this was generally dispersed, is that the ideal was to be either on your own as an entrepreneur, an artisan, or the rural counterpart of a freehold farmer. Okay, a good many of your laboring class consisted of immigrants, increasingly Irish Catholics who were discriminated against and kind of marginalized. But and some women, especially in the 1830s and in the 1840s. So there was a growing industrial working class sector in American society.
particularly in the North, is that
Yeah,
right?
oh yeah, especially in the North. The South had a little bit of industry, but this is one of the things that really causes this rift. It doesn't cause the rift, but it was pointed to, and that is the North was growing at a much faster rate, both in terms of population, in terms of diversification, in terms of industry. Now, the North was still agricultural up till the Civil War, but industries were taking root. And in terms of overall wealth, and in terms of social mobility for whites, than the South was. And the South was losing out. Now, of course, New England was losing out too, to westward settlement. But what made the South feel particularly vulnerable was the fact that they had the practice of slavery, which was the basis of their way of life. And, many whites in the South, not only those who owned slaves, but the majority who didn't own slaves, felt that, if this situation continues, if new states come into the Union where slavery is prohibited, what's to prevent the federal government from enacting law, coming to the conclusion, well, slavery is uncivilized. It's, if we're going to be a free country, let's get rid of slavery. What's to stop them?
All right, I have two sort of related questions here, two sides of the same coin. One, we know that racism existed in the North.
Oh, sure.
And continues, obviously, to this
Yeah.
day, but was rampant at the time. What was the nature of the resistance to allowing slavery to expand? Was it strictly the economic one that you said before about the unfair competition, or what? Well, I mean, because you say this was an increasingly socially mobile part of the country, and was it that people felt like, well, I'm not going to be able to get my share of the pie if I have to compete with a slaveholding?
Well, I think, Chris, it depends who you talk to. The antagonism towards slavery as something immoral, something un-American almost. That sentiment was growing. It was never the majority until probably near the end of the Civil War itself. But that sentiment was growing. I think, the factors you mentioned, competition from slave owners and racism, those are part of it. But also, I think there was this notion that, slavery was increasingly being seen as a kind of retrograde institution. And why nurture it by allowing it to expand into the West? Now, not everybody agreed with that, but that sentiment was definitely growing in the 1850s in the North.
Retrograde meaning what? That we were progressing beyond this as a civilization?
Yes,
We're better than this?
And I wouldn't overlook, the libertarian and egalitarian rhetoric of the American Revolution. Now, of course, critics of the United States, including dissenters in the United States, would say, wait a minute, the United States talks about life, liberty, et cetera, and yet tolerates the institution of slavery. But that sentiment was there. Those ideals were really part of the American political identity. And so there were, I think, inevitably going to be people who became known as abolitionists, who said, wait a minute, this is, this contradicts our basic ideals. This is hypocritical. And I think there's also another factor, a big cultural change that started in the 1790s, and that is the Second Great Awakening or the Great Revival. In other words, this big upsurge in, I guess you could call it religious fervor. Now, it's not to be confused with fanaticism, but a notion that, society needs, there are ills in the society and they need to be eradicated or dealt with. And one of those was slavery. Slavery, by the 1830s, you get a body of opinion that says slavery is a sin. Okay? And the answer to sin is to stop sinning.
Well, as we know, there's from the country's inception, there's been this conflict about to what extent do we want to have a democratic society. So you've got the sort of Jeffersonian conception of democracy, and then the Jacksonian conception of a more limited democracy. And this has been a debate that's been swinging back and forth right up through the New Deal era and right up through the current neoliberal era that we live in now. But I want to go back real quick to the other side of the question that I asked before. Obviously, you had to be quite privileged, quote unquote privileged in Southern society to have the wealth to be able to afford to own slaves. So it must have been, correct me if I'm wrong, but the majority of Southerners did not own slaves.
No, the majority of white Southerners didn't own slaves.
That's right. And so
that's true.
So the question is, why did they take up arms in defense of this institution?
Well, first of all, not all of them did. I mean, one of the things that this is where I find the Civil War to me is fascinating, and James McPherson, who's probably one of the leading Civil War scholars today, estimates that about 50,000 books, I don't know where he got that figure, have been written on the Civil War, and it's probably been more, But, both the North and the South were divided during the Civil War. There were substantial areas of the South that did not want to go along with secession, that is, breaking up the Union. Now, they may have supported, their people may have supported slavery, but the defense of slavery wasn't worth tearing apart the United States of America, okay? And there was dissent in the North. One of the bloodiest riots in American society took place in July of 1863, right after the Battle of Gettysburg. And it was a protesting not only the draft, which had been implemented earlier in the year, but also against the Emancipation Proclamation. So when you're dealing with the South, in many ways, there were deep divisions in the South, especially between the areas in the hill country, the Appalachian region, where there weren't that many slaves, and the areas where the Black Belt along the Tidewater and Piedmont areas of the South, where the slave-owning elite pretty much ran things. They were able to maintain control by a number of methods. One is deeply entrenched racism. There's been a lot of debate over when, modern racism began, but in fact, it probably predates English colonization in America. This notion of black equals enslavement, white equals free. And white people had privileges. Even if they were poor, they were free. Blacks were not. And it was easy to cultivate this notion of racial superiority, what they later called an aristocracy of race. The other thing, too, is that the slave owners pretty much dominated all of local and state politics. And especially starting, you see it in the early 19th century, any serious dissension in the South against slavery was repressed. People were charged with sedition and run out of town or run out of the state. And any expression of dissent was crushed. And what was to stop it? States had that kind of authority. And also there was always, especially now when we talk about movement to the West, it's not just into the upper Midwest, it's also into the Southwest, that is Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and so forth, and Tennessee. And it was possible for Southerners like Andrew Jackson, who was born in South Carolina. Very poor circumstances to move there, acquire land, acquire slaves, and become part of the slave-owning elite, or at least begin to identify with it. And, so, yes, there was social mobility of that sort.
For whites.
For whites, obviously. Yeah.
Okay, so take me back to we've got this fledgling new party, the Republican Party, that is sort of presenting themselves as something of a progressive party for the day, right?
I back away from those terms because they weren't used at the time.
Okay.
Certainly, the Republican Party saw itself as embodying, the best. I mean, it wasn't compromised by slavery. They were opposed to the expansion of slavery. Now, almost all of those who would be considered abolitionists, people who wanted to get rid of slavery entirely, signed on with the Republican Party because they saw free soil as a part of a strategy of a first step towards gaining control of the federal government, especially in the U.S. Senate.
Can you explain for listeners free soil? You mean
free soil was the position that of opposition to any expansion into new territories or territories where in other words, no more territories would be admitted as states if they permitted slavery. In other words, for a territory to become a state, it had to abolish, it had to prohibit slavery.
Okay, so you've got this party. It's new. It's competing with other more entrenched parties.
Well, no, only one other party.
So the Whigs had completely fallen apart.
The Whigs had pretty much disintegrated after the election of 1852.
Okay.
And it's the Republicans, and the Republican Party was a coalition. There were abolitionists, some of whom were identified with the Liberty Party, which was a very small party, and it ran in 1840. Former Whigs like Abraham Lincoln, and Free Soil Northern Democrats who coalesced into this new party. Now, I mean, in addition to Free Soil alone wasn't going to, do the trick for the Republicans, but they also espoused what were called internal improvements sponsored by the federal government. They also wanted homestead legislation to facilitate the development of viable small farms in the Trans-Mississippi West. They wanted higher tariffs to nurture industries in the United States.
And at the time, the Democratic Party was split pretty much.
Well, yeah, splits did develop. I mean, both the Democrats and the Whigs split up, but for the Whigs, it was disastrous. It was not only slavery. Well, part of the problem with the Whig Party was this: when the Mexican War broke out in 1846, there was furious dissent against it. I mean, we think the Vietnam War was divisive, but so was the Mexican War. And much of the opposition to the Mexican War came from anti-slavery Whigs, Northern Whigs, who denounced the Mexican War as an act of aggression by what they called a slave power. Okay? So now, obviously, they didn't stop the war, and it was successful from the standpoint of the United States. But what happened is that in the South, there were Southern Whigs, and they got lambasted by Democrats as being in league with abolitionists. Being in league with an abolitionist in the South was the kiss of death politically, And so, the Whig Party disintegrated. The Democrats they were also split over immigration.
The Whigs or the Democrats?
The Whigs were.
Yeah.
It was discovered that their candidate for president, Winfield Scott, had sent his daughter to a Catholic school, and that caused a big scandal because in addition to being anti-slavery, many of these people were anti-Catholic.
The
Okay.
abolitionists were.
Well, I wouldn't say all abolitionists were, but quite a number of anti-slavery people were also distrustful of the Catholic Church. And, starting in the 1830s, the United States was witnessing an influx of primarily Irish Catholics. And there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment and violence. And, with convents being burned and schools being attacked and so forth, including one big riot down here in Bath.
Oh, yeah?
Yes.
And
Yes.
when did that happen?
Well, I don't remember. The Maine Historical Society, I believe, has a 3-part kind of painting where a meeting house was rented out to some Catholics, probably laborers, dock workers and so forth. And the first panel shows the meeting. The second panel shows this mob of Protestants gathered together. And the third panel shows the meeting house on fire. And then, of course, the sky is darkened, which shows that the painter, saw this as darkness descending on the land, this kind of violence, So there are those issues which are dividing. Now, the Democrats tended to be much more successful in getting the immigrant vote. They haven't changed in that respect.